I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Prince William did not raise his voice when he changed the future of the monarchy. He simply placed his signature beneath an emergency royal decree, looked across the room at his eldest son, and spoke the words nobody expected to hear so soon. George would no longer stand quietly behind his father as merely the next generation. William had named him Prince Regent, and the silence that followed felt heavier than celebration. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William kept one hand beside the signed page as the emergency meeting inside Windsor fell silent. Catherine watched George instead of the document. Charles read the wording twice before lowering the paper. Only a circle of advisors remained after a crisis forced one question. If royal authority were disrupted, who would stand beside the future king and preserve continuity? An emergency royal decree, in this dramatized account, was a special order for an extraordinary situation. While a regent traditionally performs sovereign duties when a monarch cannot fully exercise them, George did not smile. His fingers tightened around the chair as William pushed the decree toward him and said, "This begins now." The words landed harder than ceremony. The designation did not make the young prince king, but it gave him a temporary representative role beside his father, drawing him closer to constitutional briefings and responsibilities that had once seemed years away. Catherine felt the meaning immediately. Her son sat in the same chair, yet the expectations surrounding him had changed in seconds. Charles felt the shift too. The king set the document down without speaking, because he understood what William had accelerated. A generational transition he expected to unfold slowly and much later. George looked toward his grandfather for reassurance, but the older monarch gave none at first. He was not angry at the boy. He was unsettled by the speed. William finally revealed, through a documented private briefing prepared for the family, that the decree had not been written that morning. A sealed draft had existed for weeks. Catherine turned toward him sharply. Then she found the clause he had never discussed with her. George would begin attending selected constitutional briefings immediately. Catherine asked the question everyone was avoiding. What had convinced William that this could no longer wait? He looked at George before answering. It was not the crisis. It was something his son had done only days earlier. William had signed the decree, but to understand why he trusted George with such weight, the family first had to confront what each of them stood to lose. George had spent his life being prepared for a crown he was never supposed to touch, while still young. Now preparation had become participation. William saw discipline in his son. Catherine saw the childhood disappearing behind that discipline. Charles saw history moving faster than anyone could control. And George, trapped between their expectations, understood something none of them could soften for him. The decree had given him importance before it had given him certainty. Catherine waited until the advisors were gone before confronting William. She told him quietly that teaching their son about service was one thing, but allowing the institution to claim too much of him too early was something else entirely. George stood directly behind his father in the line of succession, meaning every choice surrounding his upbringing carried consequences far beyond one household. People would one day judge the future of the monarchy through the boy he became. William understood that weight, but he believed protecting George from responsibility could become its own danger. William answered with something more personal than constitutional. He had spent years believing heirs should understand duty before crisis suddenly forced it upon them. The future king did not want his son learning the hardest truths only when the crown was already demanding answers. Catherine heard the fear beneath his reasoning. He was not simply preparing George. He was trying to prevent old wounds from repeating themselves. George later found his mother alone and asked the question she had been hoping he would never need to ask. Did his father choose him because he was ready, or because William was afraid? Catherine hesitated. That pause told him enough. She finally said that love and fear could exist inside the same decision, but neither changed the fact that he still had the right to feel uncertain. William entered his son's room expecting questions about protocol and constitutional briefings. Instead, George asked about Charlotte and Louis. Would they now be treated differently because he had become Prince Regent? William stopped before answering. He promised that responsibility must never become distance from his brother and sister, because the title would mean nothing if it cost him the family he was meant to protect. Charles delivered the sharper warning later. In a private recorded conversation prepared for the family archive, the king told William that once the public began seeing George as an active symbol of continuity, returning him fully to the background might become impossible. The prince did not argue. He admitted he already understood that risk. William then revealed why he had accepted it. George had shown a steadiness during a recent royal crisis that nobody expected from someone his age. Catherine pressed him to name the moment. William finally did. It had happened inside a closed royal ceremony when senior adults froze after protocol suddenly collapsed, and George stepped forward. The decree had shocked the palace, but its true beginning lay several days earlier, in one ceremony that quietly became George's point of no return. Nobody entered the ceremony expecting history to move. It was meant to be controlled, private, almost routine. Then a message reached William. An advisor whispered urgently to Charles, and the order of events collapsed within seconds. Senior figures hesitated. Instructions contradicted one another. George watched the confusion from the edge of the room. Then, without being asked, he crossed the space between childhood and duty, and William never looked at him the same way again. George had been invited to the Windsor continuity ceremony only to observe. The event was a closed family and constitutional rehearsal, designed to test who would carry ceremonial and representative duties if the sovereign or heir were suddenly unavailable. William wanted his son to understand how responsibility moved through the monarchy without forcing him to carry any of it. Charles agreed. For George, the lesson was supposed to remain theoretical. Charles suddenly received an urgent private communication and stepped away. Almost immediately, two sets of instructions collided. William was pulled into a separate discussion with senior officials. The rehearsal stalled, and nobody seemed willing to make the next move. George saw Charlotte waiting for direction. He saw courtiers looking toward one another. Then he stepped forward. George did not announce himself. He quietly guided the younger family members through the prepared order, then confirmed the next ceremonial step with a senior courtier, while everyone waited for William to return. Charlotte followed his lead without question. When his father came back, he found his son beside the central table, calm enough to keep the room moving. George looked at him and asked only, "Was that what I was supposed to do?" William felt pride first. Then came something colder. His son had not acted because he wanted attention. He had acted because uncertainty had spread through the room, and someone needed to stop it. That instinct mattered, because kingship was built around exactly that kind of pressure, staying steady when hesitation could shake everyone else. Catherine reacted very differently when she learned what had happened. She was not angry because George had failed. She was frightened because he had succeeded so naturally. The thought that adults had allowed him to carry even a few minutes of responsibility unsettled her. She knew competence could become its own trap. William later received a documented account of the rehearsal, noting that George had been the only young royal to recognize immediately which duties still needed continuity. He kept the report privately. That evening, William opened a sealed contingency draft already prepared for future emergencies. He read one line twice, then ordered the designation changed. The new words were simple: Prince Regent. Catherine discovered the alteration before Charles had even been consulted. George's instinct convinced William, but William's secrecy would now force father and son into the most dangerous argument of the entire crisis. Charles closed the door himself. No private secretary remained inside. No advisor could interrupt. For the first time since the decree was signed, king and heir stood facing each other, not as constitutional partners, but as father and son. Charles believed William had placed history on George's shoulders before history demanded it. William believed waiting would be the greater betrayal. Neither man intended to surrender, because both thought they were protecting the same boy. Charles placed the signed decree on the table between them. Royal preparation, he argued, had always moved slowly for a reason. An heir needed time to develop judgment before every mistake became part of the public record. Because once formal responsibility began, even ordinary uncertainty could be treated as constitutional weakness. William did not look away. He answered that the modern monarchy no longer had the luxury of pretending crisis would wait until everyone felt ready. Charles pushed harder. He asked whether William himself would have accepted that kind of burden at George's age. The prince looked down at the decree before answering. "I wish someone had trusted me enough to explain what was coming." The words landed like accusation. Charles heard more than disagreement. He heard an old wound. The king reacted sharply. He warned William not to turn unresolved pain from his own youth into policy for George. But the future king fired back that this was exactly why he intended to remain beside his son through every stage. He would not simply prepare the boy from a distance and then expect him to understand duty when the pressure became real. Their argument was no longer about procedure. It had become a brutal question about what a father owed an heir. Charles then revealed, through a recorded private conversation kept for the family archive, that he had reviewed an earlier version of William's contingency framework months before. A contingency framework was simply a prepared plan for how royal duties would continue during disruption. He had refused to support the Prince Regent clause because he believed George should remain outside formal responsibility for as long as possible. William admitted he knew, but the Windsor ceremony had changed everything. George had shown calm, not because he wanted power, but because everyone else needed someone dependable. That, William said, was the difference. George entered moments later, after being summoned. He heard enough to understand that 2 generations were arguing about his future without him. He did not defend the decree. He looked at both men and said he would accept the responsibility only if they stopped speaking about him as though he had no voice. Charles fell silent. William did too. The family argument had become painfully personal. But beyond that closed door lay an even harder truth. Emotion no longer controlled what William had set in motion. William could command a room, but he could not command the monarchy by emotion alone. The decree carried signatures, safeguards, limitations, and consequences that stretched far beyond one family argument. Yet the most important person studying those pages was not an advisor or constitutional expert. It was George himself. He sat with the document before him, reading every condition slowly, because he had begun to understand that accepting a title was easy. Understanding its limits was harder. George asked William to explain everything, not just what he could do, but what he could not. The emergency royal decree was a temporary internal framework designed for extraordinary instability, setting out limited responsibilities while leaving sovereign authority with Charles and principal constitutional control with the future king. The title Prince Regent did not make George king, nor did it give him power over government. It allowed selected ceremonial duties, briefings, and representative responsibilities, meant to preserve continuity if pressure on the monarchy suddenly intensified. William heard something important in his son's questions. George was not asking how much authority he had gained. He was asking where it ended. That mattered, because power without limits could overwhelm someone far older, and this role had arrived before the young prince had finished learning what ordinary life felt like. George finally admitted what frightened him most. He feared people would stop seeing him as himself and begin judging every mistake as proof of the king he might become. William did not offer an easy reassurance. He told George that royal duty and identity could never be separated completely, but responsibility did not have to consume everything around it. He promised that every new duty would grow only when his son was ready. Then he showed him the protection Catherine had fought to place inside the decree. If the role damaged George's education, welfare, or family life, William could suspend his active responsibilities immediately. Charles discovered another clause moments later. George was required to receive direct constitutional instruction from both his father and grandfather. The arrangement had not pushed the king aside. It had tied 3 generations together. Charles entered the briefing without warning. George looked up, unsure what reaction was coming. The monarch said almost nothing. Instead, he pulled out the chair beside his grandson, opened the first state paper, and began explaining it himself. A state paper was simply an official document dealing with government or royal business. But in that moment, it carried something more personal: reluctant acceptance. William watched the exchange and understood the argument had changed. Charles was no longer trying to erase the decree. George was no longer afraid to question it. But that fragile peace lasted only hours. Charles had finally taken the chair beside his grandson. But outside that room, the decree was already reshaping George's life faster than any of them could contain. Catherine had feared the decree would change George someday. She did not expect to notice the change before the first full day was over. His schedule shifted. Private lessons moved. Security briefings appeared where ordinary family time had been. Then she saw the moment that hurt most. Charlotte began joking about needing an appointment to see her brother, and George laughed with everyone else. Catherine did not. She understood that jokes often arrived before resentment dared speak plainly. Catherine received the revised weekly schedule and read it twice. Constitutional tuition, meaning lessons designed to teach George how the monarchy works with government and public duty, now sat beside carefully limited appearances and selected meetings. William had insisted the Prince Regent role remain controlled, not turned into ceremonial theater. George would not suddenly be sent across the country or treated like a working adult. Every duty was supposed to be measured against school, privacy, and age. But to his mother, even controlled change still looked like change. Catherine removed her glasses and placed the schedule down. William immediately understood what the silence meant. She told him institutions always called new duties temporary, until the person performing them became useful enough to be needed constantly. George's strength worried her almost as much as weakness would have. If he handled every task well, she feared his success would become the excuse for giving him more. George heard part of the argument from nearby and carried the guilt with him. Later, he told Charlotte that perhaps refusing the title would have made everything easier. His sister did not laugh this time. She took his hand and told him she did not want him to refuse, because of them. She only wanted him to remember one thing: being important to the country did not make him more important inside the family. George held on to those words because they were simpler than any decree. William, meanwhile, was already fighting a battle Catherine had not seen. In a documented private scheduling note prepared for the household, he personally cancelled 2 appearances advisors had proposed for George. One would have required additional travel. The other would have pushed aside protected study time. He rejected both. Catherine discovered the cancellations later and stopped cold. For the first time, she saw clearly that William was not blindly accelerating their son. He was trying to control the same institutional hunger she feared, even while defending the decree itself. That changed something between them. Catherine no longer wanted only to stop the arrangement. She wanted to shape it. For the first time, Catherine stopped asking whether the decree should exist, and began asking what George would need if it remained. The palace had spent days discussing George as an heir, a symbol, and now a Prince Regent. That night, William and Catherine spoke about him only as their son. No officials waited outside with folders. No constitutional wording stood between them. The argument that had divided them finally became simpler. If George could not escape the responsibility, then his parents would have to make sure responsibility never swallowed the person carrying it. Catherine told William she would support the arrangement, but only with limits they controlled as parents. Removing the decree entirely after activating it could create fresh instability and make it appear the family had lost confidence in George. Yet allowing the role to expand without restraint carried a different danger. They agreed on one principle: responsibility should educate their son, not consume him. William admitted something he had not said before. He had feared Catherine's resistance meant she doubted George. She answered immediately. She had resisted because she knew exactly how seriously their son would take every expectation placed upon him. He would not shrug off duty. He would absorb it. That was what frightened her. William then confessed, in a private recorded conversation kept within the family, that naming George Prince Regent had been driven partly by his own anxiety about sudden succession. He feared unfinished preparation. He feared crisis arriving before his son understood what it demanded. Catherine listened, then told him softly that George could not be made to carry fears that belonged to his father. The decision changed from there. Together, they created a private family rule, limiting official briefing days, protecting school commitments, preserving time with Charlotte and Louis, and setting aside periods when ceremonial discussion would simply stop. Those limits mattered, because royal duty could easily expand once someone proved capable. William knew that now. Catherine had known it from the beginning. George listened as his parents explained the new boundaries together. He expected another list of obligations. Instead, Catherine told him, "There will still be days when nobody needs anything from you except us." The tension in him eased almost immediately. William saw it and understood just how much his son had been carrying without saying so. George then surprised them both. He wanted Charles involved in his instruction. His grandfather, he said, understood what it meant to wait for the crown in a way his father never had. William did not resist. Catherine did not either. That request finally brought 3 generations into alignment. Inside the family, the decree had finally found its limits. Outside the palace gates, millions were about to give it a meaning of their own. By morning, George's name was everywhere. What had begun behind closed doors now belonged to broadcasters, newspapers, crowds, commentators, and strangers who had never heard his voice in private. Some saw continuity. Others saw a childhood shortened by history. Inside Windsor, George watched the reaction with his parents beside him and discovered the strangest part of royal life. Millions of people could debate what his future meant, while he was still trying to understand it himself. William read the palace statement before it was released. The announcement confirmed that the emergency decree had given George a limited and supervised Prince Regent role, designed to preserve continuity during extraordinary circumstances, not to replace Charles or accelerate succession. A palace statement was simply the monarchy's official public explanation of a major decision. But this one carried unusual weight because it introduced the country to a new version of George. Within minutes, admiration and concern collided. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered beneath the balcony as newspapers moved through raised hands. One front page carried the words, "3 generations, 1 crown. George steps forward." A parent lifted a child above the crowd, while people applauded as the statement was read aloud on television. Yet the reaction was not entirely celebratory. Some questioned whether so much symbolic responsibility should sit on shoulders still young enough to be protected from it. George watched an evening broadcast beside Catherine. The presenter described the decree as the monarchy publicly training its future before crisis chooses the timetable. At first, he listened quietly. Then commentators began examining his temperament. his confidence, even the way he had reacted during previous public appearances. Catherine saw his expression change and switched the television off before the discussion ended. George later asked William a question that cut through all the public noise. Did the cheering mean people expected him never to be frightened? The future king answered carefully. Courage, he told his son, did not mean living without fear. It meant understanding the duty ahead and still choosing to face it. Charles then ended one of the most dangerous rumors surrounding the decree. In a recorded public address, the king praised continuity across generations, making clear that he accepted George's new place beside William. Later, away from cameras, he gave his grandson a small handwritten notebook filled with lessons from his own years as heir. They were not rules. They were mistakes he wished he had understood sooner. George held the notebook longer than anyone expected. The title had been given by William, accepted by Charles, and judged by the public. But only George could decide what it would ultimately mean. George never asked for the decree. He never demanded the title, and he never celebrated the attention it brought. That became the reason the family finally trusted him with it. When he entered the final private meeting with William, Catherine, and Charles, he carried no speech prepared by advisors. He carried only a decision. He would serve as Prince Regent, but he would do it without pretending he was already the man history expected him to become. George sat with the final arrangement before him and understood exactly what it meant. His role would remain narrow: supervised constitutional education, limited representation, and selected ceremonial participation, with no independent sovereign authority. In simple terms, the structure was meant to prepare him for future duty without treating him as king before his time. William had wanted readiness. Catherine had demanded protection. Charles had wanted restraint. For the first time, all three needs now existed inside the same agreement. George looked first at his father, then at his mother and grandfather. He said he would accept the responsibility on one condition: nobody could use the title to pretend he was ready for things he had not yet learned. William answered immediately. He agreed. The future king understood that his son was not rejecting duty. He was defining the line between preparation and pressure. Catherine felt something inside her finally settle. Her greatest fear had changed. She no longer feared only what responsibility might take from George. She now understood that teaching him to set boundaries could become one of the most important lessons of his life. Her son did not need protection from every burden. He needed permission to admit when a burden was too heavy. Charles then broke his silence in a recorded private family conversation. He admitted that William's decree had initially felt like an attempt to rush past his generation. Now he understood it differently. The decision had forced grandfather, father, and son to prepare together before an emergency could divide them. William finally explained the purpose that had driven him from the beginning. Naming George Prince Regent had never been about replacing Charles, speeding up his own accession, or announcing an imminent succession. It was about making sure the monarchy's youngest future leader learned responsibility, while people who loved him were still close enough to guide him. Charles placed the old handwritten notebook into George's hands. William rested a hand on his son's shoulder. Catherine told him they were going home together. George closed the document instead of reading it again. That gesture said everything. The decree had changed his status, but it had not taken his childhood entirely. It had forced 3 generations to confront succession before crisis could make the choice for them. William's astonishing decision ultimately strengthened the monarchy, not by giving George more power, but by teaching the family how power should be handed down, with preparation, limits, honesty, and love. The title became a promise, not a burden. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.